everybody. I love that I see people just moving up front, because like we asked you guys if you could move up front. Now, those of you who are at the way back there, I know you're probably going to be like, seriously, Annie? But if you could possibly move closer, that would be great. Also, is Emily Davison here by chance? Because we do still have a copy of Emily's Unearthing Joy for her. So if you know Emily or see Emily, and you can let her know we have her copy of her text for her. But thank you as you're moving up front. We're going to hear so much this morning from Dr. Tortorelli, who's going to be going through another one of the curricular examination tools that we started alluding to yesterday. And thank you, all of you who gave your information about the curricular resources you're using and programs, because we'll be working on those today too. So I think we're ready to get started. I'll send it to you.
All right. Think about it this way. If you move up to this to like a table up front, you get to stay up front all day, right? Like you're going to grab the good seats from everybody else. You'll have a front row seat for the whole day. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Yeah, we're going to continue our discussion of coaching around curricular resources. And I wanted to start by returning to our anchor text and having a minute to discuss. We talked about this theory of action yesterday, but now I want to highlight how in each space where we have high quality instructional materials, curriculum training, time for instruction, and professional collaboration, Dr. Walpole really breaks that down into phases. And she says that the districts that you are working with can be in these different phases in relationship to all four of these enabling conditions that are part of our theory of change. One of you, I want to not totally ignore the school level norms. A lot of you have brought up issues of school level norms and admin support, and that is absolutely an important thing. I've already talked to Erin a little bit about how this work can be shared or expanded to include administrators in school level building leadership. But we're not ignoring that or forgetting that exists. But within these phases, these enabling conditions, these top four enabling conditions, there are four phases. Exploration, which means you're just getting started thinking about selecting high quality instructional materials or thinking about the time for providing enough time for instruction, or thinking about professional collaboration. But then there's also preparation, where you're making moves to actually make these things happen in the way that you want them to happen in your districts. Implementation, where you are trying things out and observing and seeing and collecting data and seeing how it's going. And then sustainment, when things are working the way you want them to work, what kinds of things do you need to have in place to keep that going and keep that success going? So I want to start by just giving us a chance to reflect for a minute on these enabling conditions in your district and these phases. What phase are your schools and districts in regarding each of these four conditions? And what key areas are you going to want to target for improvement this year? You can't do everything. Let's just keep that in mind, right? Like, we want to think about where we are in relationship to these enabling conditions, which ones need the most support coming up this year. So we'll go ahead and take a few minutes to talk. If you're in Zoom, you can respond via the chat. Oh, and if you're at a new table, introduce yourself to your table mates too. Okay, finish up your last thought. We will have an opportunity for you to share with us at the end of today's session what would be most helpful for you going forward in this pathway this year. I did also want to say that the building facilitators have told us that they are aware that the air conditioning is doing the opposite thing today that it's been doing all week. It's been very cold in here all week, and today it's very hot. So they're working on it, and we think we'll get that straightened out. All right. So we're going to dive in today. I know that you're probably getting a little bit tired of talking about curriculum rubrics, but we are going to talk about one more. And because one thing that you may have noticed yesterday when I was going over the pros and cons of the different curriculum rubrics is that actually this equity piece, which is central to the revised essentials, has always been central to the essentials, but is central to the text of the revised essentials, and is central to Dr. Walpole's theory of curriculum plus coaching and theory of change, is not really, it wasn't really mentioned yesterday, right? We didn't talk about that at all. And we know that, and so I just wanted to highlight, like, what is it, did we miss something? Did I just not get to that yesterday? Well, no. There is a few, I actually had read these through before, and I was like, I don't think they talk about equity or diversity in these rubrics at all. And I was like, that's interesting. And so I actually did a double check yesterday because I was like, I don't want to present this if it's not accurate. And so I was actually opening up all the PDFs and doing the find function to make sure I hadn't missed any key terms. But here's what I found. The Reading League mentions that kids should read diverse texts. They don't really define what diverse text means. And then there's a note at the bottom that's like, we're not even talking about culturally responsive instruction. That's an important thing that's not in your rubric. And so these are rubrics that are really designed to be aligned to the research. Remember, we've been talking about alignment to research, alignment to equity, and alignment to culture, to local cultural norms. And we have talked a lot, this is addressed in some of our other readings. For example, in Unearthing Joy, there's a section on unearthing curriculum and instruction where Dr. Muhammad points to some big national problems with curriculum. This is a summary. This is not her entire list, but you can go to page 51 for her entire list. But she says it's unclear who's writing these materials and what their experiences are working with youth of color and disadvantaged youth, that there's not a lack of focus in on culturally responsive education in curriculum. Many curriculum are focused entirely on skill building and not any of the other pursuits, only skills. They can be difficult to navigate for teachers. They don't reflect the histories, identities, literacies, or liberation of people of color. They often present historical narratives from one perspective, often the colonizer perspective, and they often don't highlight the genius and joy of people of color. So even when there is some representation and diversity, there are still some additional issues with our curricula. And this is broader than just literacy curricula, but it certainly applies to literacy curricula. And so on the next page, on page 52, she has a list of suggestions for how to deal with curricular problems. And we'll return to that longer list later when we have identified some of the problems. But one of the things that she recommends is that, we should create a rubric for publishers so that they know what we're looking for. And that we can use that to hold them accountable for creating more equitable resources. But someone already has, which is great. So I want to spend a little time talking about this culturally relevant education ELA scorecard that was created at NYU Steinhardt School of Education. It's designed to do this, to fill this gap and provide a culturally responsive lens to look at specifically English language arts materials. And they have 3 categories: representation, social justice, and teachers' materials. And this is part of the representation. It's not the whole thing. They have other questions that they ask about representation, but I actually really like this because it's so concrete. There's a little chart in there where you just count up the number of, let me see, I have to make it bigger, but the number of characters that show up in the literature that you've reviewed. Now, you can't review every single book across the curriculum, but the number of characters that are in each of these categories depicted in the literature. There's also an author tally, with a similar chart where you count up the number of authors that fall into each of these categories. And then it also talks about, the diversity and the accuracy of those portrayals of characters of people from diverse backgrounds. So that's cool. They also have lots of other questions that you can ask about your curriculum. And they also dig deep into social justice, getting to Dr. Muhammad's issue of how historical events and events are being portrayed, whose perspective is being privileged, whether multiple perspectives are included, and whether these things that are from the past or things from fictional texts are actually connected to real issues today in the classroom. And then finally, it includes a deep dig into the teachers' materials to see if there's any guidance for teachers to modify the curriculum based on who they're teaching. And I actually think this is really important. We teach a lot in my teacher preparation program that we should be doing culturally responsive and culturally sustaining pedagogy to our students. But we sometimes have a hard time putting that into practice because our students don't have students yet, right? They're hypothetical future students. So we're asking them to become culturally responsive educators without actually knowing who they have to be culturally responsive to, and it's really different, right? Like you can't just build your diverse classroom library and be like, I'm done, I have a culturally responsive classroom, because you might be teaching in Detroit one year, and you might decide to move to Dearborn and have a totally different population that you need to represent, and that you need to understand, and that you need to connect with. Like, it could be completely different. Being responsive is something that is an ongoing project that changes depending on who's in your classroom every year. And it's such a hard thing for my teacher candidates to understand. They're like, no, I know it. I know how to do it. I'm done, you know? And you're like, you'll never be done. You have to keep doing this work forever. And so I think that can happen to teachers as well. They're like, well, I got my books. I have my diverse classroom library. What else, right? And so I really appreciate that this rubric is trying to hold curricula responsible for telling teachers how to modify things for different populations of students to make sure it's really connecting with them and their communities and their backgrounds. So I appreciate that's in here, that is in here. You can score each there's a bunch of different questions for each category, and you could be scored as very satisfied, satisfied, unclear, and not satisfied. And I actually kind of appreciate that either has to be positive or negative. There's no zero. They push you in one direction or the other. And they really this really highlights all of the important, I just wanted to bring this in and talk about this rubric a little bit, because it's, these shouldn't really be separate rubrics, right? Like there are lots and lots of benefits of being culturally responsive for literacy learning. This is evidence-based practice, right? These are not separate from, but I do think it comes down to what Dr. Mohammed identifies as like separating out skills and thinking we can just focus on skills in a couple of places and then bringing in the other stuff later. But really it's highly integrated. And so we know that teaching from a culturally responsive way increases academic engagement, attendance, graduation rates, and civic engagement. And it also encourages positive self-image, definition, and critical consciousness in students. So we don't want to leave this part out when we're looking at curriculum materials and thinking about how they might need to be improved or supplemented. And this is critical to coaching work because again, because of that local contextual piece. It's going to change. Teachers are going to need support in responding to their communities. So I wanted to give you some examples of how some popular curricula, we've been talking large, full core curriculum, have scored on this review, so we could talk about what we might, and how we might respond as literacy coaches. This rubric that I just described was used by scholars to evaluate three very popular, they said they were the three most widely used core curriculum at the time that they did the study. I don't know if that's still true. Hold on. The Wonders curriculum, the Into Reading curriculum, and Savas Reading Company, My View. And so the question that they asked, using this rubric to answer, was, to what extent are the three most commonly used elementary curricula culturally responsive? And again, we're not here to like denigrate or cheerlead for any particular curriculum, but it's important that we know the pros and cons of the materials that we're working with so that we can address those. Here are the findings. We found that these three curricula, which collectively reach millions of students across the country, have deficits that are not often being raised in the current public debate about curriculum. Their texts, language, tone, and guidance communicate harmful messages to students of all backgrounds, especially Black, Indigenous, students of color, LGBTQIA+ students, and students with disabilities. Not great. More specifically, all three curricula were rated culturally destructive or culturally insufficient. There were actually 5 categories, and these were the bottom 2, and all 3 curricula fell into the bottom 2. Culturally destructive is about reinforcing stereotypes, and culturally insufficient is mostly about being ambiguous or sort of just superficial representation of diversity. So here's, I put the rubric up here so you can read more closely. They also found that all 3 curricula use superficial visual representations to signify diversity, especially skin tone and bodily presentation, without including meaningful cultural context, practice, or traditions. And I've seen this too. It's like if we've gotten better at just having more pictures of people of different races and ethnicities and language backgrounds and disability statuses in the books, but they aren't necessarily doing anything. Sometimes they're just like standing in the background, right? And so that sort of superficial representation, just showing phenotypes or symbols of culture, doesn't really get into, it doesn't do the work of making students feel seen and included, because it doesn't actually engage the larger cultural context. They found that all 3 curricula were dominated by one-sided storytelling, and provided single ahistorical narratives. For example, talking about immigration from a white European perspective in the United States. And they also found that all 3 curricula used language and tone that demeaned and dehumanized, Black, Indigenous, and characters of color, while encouraging empathy and connection with white characters. And that's a quote from the report, so the capitalization is all theirs. They have this hostile language and tone scale that they used to determine what they meant by demeaning and dehumanizing language. And then finally, the teacher's materials. All 3 curricula provided little to no guidance for teachers on engaging students' prior knowledge, backgrounds, and cultures, or reflecting on their own biases, beliefs, or experiences. So, obviously, we are not going to throw out all 3 of the most popular core reading curricula in the country, across the country. You're going to be working with these. And I actually somewhat appreciated that they were this one's good and the other 2 are bad, right? Because they're all curricula are going to have some serious issues like this, because we live in, we live in the society that we live in with the history that we have. And so it's not surprising in some respects, but it is something to be aware of. That there are going to be problems in this regard with almost all curricula. So this is something that we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking today about in our communities of practice. What are some things you as a coach can do? How can you coach around culturally destructive or insufficient materials, superficial representation of materials, single ahistorical narratives, demeaning language and tone, and the fact that there's very little guidance for teachers about what to do. So we're going to get out your notebooks and do a little written reflection and then sharing out around this problem. What are some things that you as a coach can do to support teachers in better using materials that have these very important flaws? In the Zoom group, they can also write and reflect and then share out in the chat when we move to that part.
Okay, Lisa is walking around with the mic for us. Does anyone have anything that they feel would be really helpful to share out for the group?
I want to make sure I'm addressing the question correctly. Is this just sharing what we shared at our table?
Yeah, just anything that you found sort of poignant that would be very helpful for the rest of us to think about.
I think this isn't just about curriculum awareness of these elements. This is culturally embedded beliefs that we have that we are trying to navigate everywhere we go. And so I think that even though and this is a wonderful way to begin the conversation, I think, is just around materials like facts and what we have in front of us. But I also think that there is a need for us to talk about the challenge of engaging in conversation around these topics, and how do we do that and create spaces for educators to be able to share their perspectives and really name the harm and the violence that is incited if we don't do this work.
Yeah.
And that continues to spread, I think.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I have goosebumps about that. And I think even to Dr. Walpole's article, one of the quotes we pulled out from that, right, was that this is hard work, but we have to do it. It's worth the conversation for the children that are with us. And Dr. Walpole herself, just even knowing what Laura shared with us, right? Like they know, I think that's what's sort of tricky when I think about this is this, for bookworms in particular, they know that there's an issue, they want to fix it, but they also know, right, want to be held to the research. So if you change things too quickly, then you lose the research backing, but at least starting with acknowledgement and saying, we have a plan of this is what we're going to do. And it's going to take us time and we'll do it. And I think Dr. Tortorelli is going to share a different example of how they kind of approach that afterwards. But we did, Tracy came up and was sharing something with us that I just thought was really powerful for all of us to hear.
So this kind of really hit home for me because for the last 3 years, I'm a coach in Ferndale Schools, and if you're not familiar, it's in Oakland County. It's along 8 Mile, so it borders Detroit, and we have a very, very diverse population. And so we spent 3 years knowing that Journeys was ending to look for a new curriculum. And so we went through what we thought was a very thorough process. We brought in many, many samples. Went through various rubrics, the Reading League, we went through a culturally responsive rubric checklist, and we decided to go with Wonders. We started a pilot with 18 teachers in September, and then the article that was referenced came out in December. And our school board and our admin put an immediate stop to using Wonders. They just couldn't move past the words culturally destructive. And so it was interesting, having gone through the process and looking at the article, like how much we really did overlook. The article, if you actually get the research study, talks about the languages in the books. Like we went through the culturally responsive rubric, right? But to be honest with you, we had one person of color on our committee. We were basically a bunch of white women going through. And yes, like you said, the superficial, we looked through the pictures, we looked like, oh, I don't know, is that okay? Yeah, and we're checking boxes. But they talk in the article about the language and the emotions that it evokes. And it gave an example of like George Washington and his troops, and they're at Valley Forge, and just how that language really evoked empathy about their suffering during that time. And then they compared it to a story about slavery and how that language did not evoke that same empathy. And so it was really, really eye-opening to go through this process. You know, my first response when it happened was like, oh my God, we got to start all over again. This has been a 3-year process. And again, there's nothing out there that's great, right? We're all going through that. You're looking for science of reading, you're looking for, there's not a great product or we'd all be using it. But it was really an eye-opening process and totally opened my eyes at another level, that when you're going through this stuff, to really take the time, and I know it's a lot, but it really is, it'll save you 3 years of work if you can kind of just be aware of it from the get-go. And we're still looking for we're starting all over this year, so.
Well, and I just want to point out that they only reviewed those 3 curricula, right? So you could, you can avoid those 3, but it doesn't mean that the other ones that you're considering are any better, right? There's not evidence one way or the other. So it's not just that I think there's this idea that if we just don't use those curricula, that it'll all be okay. But in fact, we have to still be very vigilant and careful, even with looking at other things. I saw another hand, though. Lots of hands. That's great.
While you're thinking, I mean, I think that's what's so tricky, right? So you put a stop to it, and then if you have people that are not understanding why we're doing this, right? And then it sort of like could fuel this very aggressive response on the other end. Well, we just spent all this money and we just went through this thing and now it's this. And I think of these things and worry about even if it's unintentional, but the emotional pieces that are evoked and how maybe there's feelings that are brought up in people that then they would be putting on people of color because they feel like they lost this time and money. And so it's like such a really complicated and complex issue because we can't be doing things that are culturally destructive, and yet we have limited resources. And so like that's why all of you being here, I'm just grateful for all of you, because I think the work, like we're just really excited about this, the work that we'll be able to start to think about this year with you and create some leadership around this, and have the throwing everything out isn't necessarily going to solve it either, for the reasons that Laura just shared, right? Like, what are you going to put in its place? Like, what is there that's made? Is there anything out there? So, so how do we approach this? It's just very complex. I mean, I wish I had that magic wand for it. We don't. But these conversations are the start to thinking about how we become more just really even more reflective. Like Tracy is so vulnerable to talk about. Like there was one person of color on the committee, and thinking about that and just saying we're all white women, right? Like that's just the fact. And so you can't know what you don't know. And so I just appreciate you sharing that example of kind of that's the real work that we're all facing right now. So
I think the example you shared was amazing, and I'm so glad that you did. And it makes me think about, you know, the more that we reject or push back against these things when we find out about it, I mean, it's all about money. So if that publisher gets enough people pushing back, and I know they want the research to be there, but if enough people just say no, that's going to start changing. And I know it's a money thing and it can't always happen easily, but I think we also need to name that in the teaching world, white women, we wield an enormous amount of power if we choose to use it. Otherwise, we can just become, I read this article that talked about how white women can be the new Jane Crow. We can just keep sustaining these bad practices, or we can try to step into our power and get more and more comfortable talking about uncomfortable issues, because it won't change until we change. Like, we, knowingly or not, have been part of the problem all along, and then we can really step into our power and have a huge impact. But we just have to get more comfortable talking about it, and the way you do that is by doing it more and more and more. So thank you for the opportunity.
Somebody else had a hand
who
up?
else had their hand up? Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Like that was powerful. Like that is the thing, right? You just have to be super uncomfortable, and you need to think like it's worth it for every kid I'm going to look at that this would be culturally destructive and harmful, right? Like we're always about the kids. Yes.
Hi, so I've been working with a district in our county recently, and they had narrowed things down to a couple of curricula, one of which was the HMH into reading. And then we learned about this report, right? And so it's like, whoa, we all kind of put the brakes on. But I think one of the things that's important in this process that we found as a committee was that we then invited HMH to come and respond to what, right? So I think it's important that we don't just take that group's word. I'm not saying they're not a credible group. They are, right? They're New York Steinhardt. But it was one group of people that perhaps had an agenda, and they're trying to change the way curricula is designed, right? And that's all good, but it's their viewpoint. So we invited HMH to come and respond, and they did. And they did so quite well, in my opinion. They take this very seriously. They have a full team of diversity, equity, and inclusion people with some pretty big names and thinkers. I think they know there are some issues in some of the things that they had. One of the things that they pointed out was that a small percentage of their curricula was reviewed in this report, less than 5% or something. Again, that doesn't negate the 5% that they looked at, that there were issues. My point of sharing this with the group is that I think it's important that you invite them to, or we use kind of our power, as the other coach just said, to push back a little and say, okay, so tell us. So this is what this report says. So now you tell us how are you addressing this, and how is this going to be fixed? And so that's where this committee is right now. Also, the committee that we're working with, is still kind of in the beginning of their journey about learning about what culturally responsive teaching even is. And so I think that's an important piece in all of this too. Sometimes, myself included, we think we know what it means, but until you've really done that self-work and learning about that, it's really hard to see things through that lens. So like this committee, even though they were excited to maybe have something new for this fall, like that's not gonna happen now because now we've slowed down. So the whole district is gonna get training now in this, so they're gonna really start to learn like what that really means, and then look at some of this curricula through a new lens. So I just hope that folks that are going through this process, or if their school boards hear about it, they invite the whatever it was to share their perspective on it. Because it was enlightening when we heard, I mean, they did a whole special presentation for us and brought in people to talk about it and just have an open, like, frank conversation. It was pretty powerful.
That's actually super exciting to me, and Dr. Tortorelli, I might say it's, but I look at what you said, Michelle, and what you just said, Bridget, and I feel like those are the two things that really go together, right? Because I'm a firm believer in, like, get everybody in the same room and let's just talk about it. Like, I actually hate confrontation, but I am totally fine with having very good discussion and debate and going through, like, some of that, cognitive crazy that you have to go through, and just speaking about like the discourse that you have to have around these things, and really find out. So, because as you were saying that, I was thinking, what if someone came to this institute, right, and the only snippet that they walked away with was the statement that Michelle just said, and that got in the headlines, right? What? I mean, yes and no, right? Then you would have legislators saying that's all they do at these literacy conferences. They're like trying to say, like, white women, and they wouldn't even have put into effect, like, we are paying legislators to say, you're gonna get trained on these essential practices. They're just sitting around having, I'm being like completely on the devil's advocate crazy side, because this is the crazy world that we live in, right? And so if we only look at the small things, so we need to say, okay, it's 5%, so what's the rest of it look like, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, like, call them, right? You can call them and use your power and say, this is unacceptable to us and we're gonna stop using your curriculum. What do you have to say about that? Like, and that, so I guess, I'm just hearing all of this for the first time, but I also think about how radical, like, the news and the media is, and so how people can sort of take something and run with it and make something real. I'm not saying this, and I'm saying this is a big deal, but what I'm saying is, like, we can be really smart and strategic about how we approach this, and we're gonna start the strategy here and keep growing that. So I feel like it's an opportunity to do that. Yeah. Oh, you did? Good. Well, that's good. So, yeah, so then you're gonna stop. That's good. That's good. Okay, so for some of you who might not have heard. Yeah. So see, like, that, what just happened to me is an example of, like, what can happen, right? So you said we did a hard stop, but you knew there was other stuff under that. You did approach them and you were like, this is still unacceptable. You approached them and you're like, you're still working on it. But, like, this is the part of the discourse of getting everybody in the room and getting really messy around it so that we can really just make really well-informed decisions, right? I mean, I think this. No. No. I mean, I would say if they came and it's not a good response, like, that's why Laura brought this up, right? We all need to be considering, is it right for any child in any district? Because even if it's not culturally harmful to other kids, things can be sending messages that are going to be harmful. You know what I'm saying? As a white child attending a school, maybe you're getting a message that's also culturally harmful because of the way it's depicting other people, even if it's not depicting you in that way. So, like, I think this is, like, really, but it's a very good discourse. I don't know.
I was just going to say that, first of all, I think we need to stop calling books and things that we purchase from consumers curriculum. They are resources, and we need to look at them as resources, and we need to be looking at our role as coaches and leaders of how we help people effectively use the resources that are in front of them. So if your district does purchase something and it does have harmful, you need to have the district support to be able to change out a story, to be able to change out a unit, to be able to do that. And something that has stuck with me is from Goldie Mohammed. She spoke in the district that I previously worked, and she said, the time for good intention is over. And we are past the point of saying that we're going to keep working and we're going to keep, like, it. I'm with the woman over there, that it needs to be a hard stop. Like, this needs to stop happening. And it is a shocking thing. We are sitting in a room with, I think I see one woman of color, and it's all white women. And I may be missing someone, and if I am, I'm sorry. But we need to be the ones that say stop. So just things to think about that were brought up.
All right, I think that's a fantastic segue into our solutions piece. We don't have all the answers, but absolutely, when this is why we have to move away from terms like fidelity, right? Because like the idea that when you buy a curriculum, you are buying a worldview, and that you have to be 100% on board with that worldview, and everyone has to be lockstep doing it. It doesn't work with some of our other priorities. And it doesn't work with some of our commitments to children and doing the right thing by children. So absolutely, I love that idea that these are resources, not the Bible, right? And that we can do different things with those resources, and that we can make changes even if we're, so we wanted to, should we bring this up?
Oh, we can have this up now.
So we
Yeah.
do want to talk
Yeah,
a
sure.
little bit about different ways of approaching solutions. I think absolutely getting people into conversation with curricular authors is huge. That is in the book. That is Goldie's goal for having a rubric, right? Is to start these conversations with publishers and hold them accountable. As I told you in our process, we did end up all, with the literacy coaches on the phone with Sharon Walpole herself talking about this, right? And she was open to that conversation and happy to be a part of that conversation. And that tells you a lot about whether you're going to want the future versions of this curriculum, right? Because curricula are revised and edited all the time. I will say another thing we should be careful about, though, is in the absence of a really good curricular review like this, curriculums that try to hype themselves as being more culturally relevant. Again, I'm not here to slam anybody else, but you want to make sure that that's not just advertising and marketing, right? You want to make sure that that actually is appropriate for your district and actually does make a difference. So as part of our curriculum selection process, we also had a CR, culturally relevant review of the books and the curricula. The other curriculum that we were considering is something that labels itself and markets itself as more culturally relevant and as including more diverse texts. And it did include some newer texts, which was fun, and teachers were excited about the newer texts. But our review, which actually, we're in a really lucky space in East Lansing where our curriculum director is a Black man and our diversity and equity director is a Black woman. And so we had we have several administrators who are people of color. And so we had a diverse team. But when they dug into the resources, they actually came away saying there was no difference between Bookworms and this other one that is marketed as being more appropriate for diverse populations. So they actually ended up saying, this is going to be up to you're going to have to make this decision on other metrics because both of these curriculum are going to need support in this area. And I thought that was really valuable to know too. So we have to, in the absence of a formal review or evidence or research, we need to also be careful of falling for hype that isn't backed up by research and evidence. So anyway, so we wanted to move into talking about some solutions. And Lisa is going to come up and talk about a solution that is part of the coaching network. The coaching network exists to help form and support some of these solutions. So.
There's not a slide for this, but we've been talking about it a lot. I just wanted to share that part of the diverse text set project, the reason why we chose to pursue that project and talk about diverse text and create some units and lessons around diverse text does coincide with what we're finding in curriculum and what Dr. Muhammad has called us to do is be careful consumers of the curriculum and resources, however you want to call those. So if that's something that you're interested in, we're going to continue on working and establishing cohorts with the Diverse Tech Set Project. I will let you know, like our first iteration of the Diverse Tech Set Project and tech selection, you'll probably have already picked up on this, but was to find representation for Black and Brown kids. And so you're not going to see a lot of diversity, diverse family structures. You're not going to see a lot about ableism, but this is just the beginning. This is where we started. So this is a drop in the bucket compared to what a full classroom library should have. But I just want you to think about, you know, as you went through that room and you looked at those texts and you took books from that room, how could those texts or other texts that are you can carefully get into, I mean, I saw your faces in that room, like looking at those texts. I saw pure joy from so many of you when you open up those books. And I know those feelings, like imagine how that could be in your classroom when you have to work with a resource that may not create those same types of feelings. How can you supplement? How can you do some moving around? Now, I understand that's not going to be easy. I was just talking to a colleague. They only 3% of their teachers in their school are certified teachers. The rest are subs. So you're popping wonders in front of that group of people, right? And you have a whole different story. So our context matters too. And there's not a lot of like the only way to have this, and right now you're enacting our mission and vision right now, team. Like we're enacting our mission and vision. This is what we signed up for. The skills, the intellect, the criticality. So I just want to say thank you for that hard conversation because it felt cringy sometimes, but it's the right conversation to be having. And that's what, believe it or not, we're part of why we're here is to have those conversations. But circling back, yeah, thank you. Circling back to the Diverse Tech Set Project, like let's keep that going. Sign up for it. Give me an email. We're going to have another cohort. Like, let's keep that going as a solution, as something that we can do, that we can put books in hands and books in our classroom and in our library, but we can also use those to do high-quality read-alouds, good vocabulary instruction, infuse those into our social studies time and science time. Because we can do that. We know how to do that. So that's my call to action for you all. Yeah.
So this is what's wonderful about being part of a network is that there are solutions. We can generate those solutions and be part of those solutions together, and we can share what's worked across different districts and ISDs. And so I wanted to share a little bit about what we ended up doing in the bookworm situation, since we did end up selecting bookworms. And I really liked the comment that we are thinking about curriculum as curricular resources, right? This is the direction we actually went with bookworms, is that we went through and we chose specific titles to replace, either because they were, we found that they had some problematic aspects. There were not necessarily problematic, I just want to give Dr. Wolf's curriculum like a fair shake here. We did not find things that were necessarily problematic for race reasons. There were actually other issues that we came up with, some, for example, like fat phobia showing up in kids' books and things like that. So there were certain books that we were that teachers were uncomfortable teaching. They were not necessarily about race representation, but there was some gendered language and stuff from older books that they weren't as crazy about. So so we chose specific books to replace for those reasons, but also just books to replace to increase the diversity of the characters and authors, right? It's like, so it's not, sometimes they weren't necessarily problematic books, but just books that space could be occupied by a higher impact book for our student population. So we chose specific titles to replace. And teachers were trained on the lesson structures and routines. Something that's nice about bookworms is that it's about trade books. So you don't so you have routines and lesson plans that are built around trade books anyway. You're not all flipping through a basal. So it was actually pretty easy to just take the lesson plan format and replace the books. And actually this was done with Dr. Walpole's knowledge, and blessing is a strong word, but she was on board with this potential solution. Because really what's important about bookworms and what's research evidenced in bookworms is those fluency routines and shared reading routines and vocabulary work. Those are the important evidence-based practices, and those can be applied to really any high-quality piece of children's literature. And so over the summer, we were lucky to have resources to put towards this, and teachers and coaches were paid to write those replacement lessons to get them ready for the fall. And one of the things that they did to really keep in the spirit of bookworms was to look for the authors that are in there, the authors of color that were writing about characters of color, and just double down on them a little bit. For example, Grace Lynn, Year of the Dog, was already in the bookworms curriculum. The teachers loved it, and so they added in Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. And then that allowed them to have like a little mini project around Grace Lynn, comparing and contrasting these two books by the same author that that are quite different. And then she did a little Zoom thing in with the kids, and it was like a little author talk and everything, and that was really exciting. So really looking for opportunity, I love, the one part of the rubric that I love is where you just count things, because it's hard to lie to yourself when you're counting things, right? And so it's easy to make a big difference in how many characters of color are appearing in your curriculum by just subbing out some books, and so some curricular resources. And so that was how they approached it in our district. Annie is going to talk next about how she approached this problem, and I really love her solution as well. Here we go. I'm going to let you take over. Sorry, I should have gotten any more heads up.
I just got some people are sending us some things that are helpful in this conversation too. So good. It is a hard conversation. Again, I think well worth it. And oh no, you're okay. Where am I? Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to share something with you that's very old, actually. There we go. This was me. So I started teaching in Massachusetts, and I first worked in a very culturally diverse group, a very culturally diverse school in Brookline, Massachusetts. So it abuts to Boston. Some of you probably heard me talk about this because it was a very powerful experience as I started being in that school system when I was 19 years old. And I was in the same system for 2.5 years, and I was teaching. I was a total part of that community starting at that age. I was at any of the meetings that we had, any committee work. I did all that work with them. We had kids in our classroom in first grade that their parents were the doctors at Beth Israel Deaconess. The mom was a writer for the Globe. The dad was a writer for the Herald. We also had amazing families whose families had just come to America. I remember little Nilka, so her mom was from Puerto Rico, and they had just come. We had Bruno, his family was from Ecuador. We had Felipe, who had moved from Chile, and then by the end of the year, he was moving to Paris, France. He was very excited about that. So these kids are now, 29 years old, right? But I just hold them in my heart all the time. And the school had also then, kids were bused in. So in Boston, they have a program called the METGO program. It's still happening today. My brother and my sister and brother-in-law live in Linfield, Mass, and they bus children in from Boston to Linfield. That's 11 miles. So it may sound, oh, that's great. I always just had a huge problem. Probably you get in trouble for so many things that I'm saying, but I have a problem with the METGO program, not because it's a program that's trying to give kids access to other school systems, because why aren't the school systems good enough for the kids that are in the city, right? That's the problem with the program, is that they're busing children out, and parents are getting their kids on a list when they're 2 years old to try and make sure they can get into the school system that they want them to go to. So it's great to have some school of choice, but then these kids aren't in schools with kids in their neighborhoods, or they're in just a completely different setting. So anyway, that was where I worked. But at the same time, even though that was really problematic in some ways. It also, we had just such a microcosm in our classrooms, right, of these different families whose, some of them were coming into Boston to go to Harvard Medical School. So we had just such a diverse group of students. And so then my first job teaching was with a woman who had taught second grade in Brookline with me, and I interviewed for the job in Westwood, Mass. Very homogeneous town, 14 miles outside of the city. There were 2 black children in the whole school, and they said, we're gonna put these children in your class, Annie, because you've worked in a city school. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, am I gonna do right by these kids? Like, how hard is that? You're in an elementary school that's K2, and you're the only children of color. Like, that was, you know, that was Terrence and Jasmine, so I still think of them, and that was in 2000, so long time ago, but I still hold them in my heart. I actually check out Terrence. I just saw him on Twitter. He's doing really great, actually. But that was like a lot of pressure on me. And one of the things when things would be presented to me is I tried to hang on to the types of experiences that I had being in a diverse setting, and like, how could we provide that for our kids? So we didn't have a curriculum. This is the other thing. So this is a very affluent town. We had standards, but we didn't have an ELA curriculum, which is, you know, a blessing and a curse. Like, what did I know? You know, I was like 22, like teaching, and it's like, okay, we're pulling this together, and we should have had more of a curriculum. We had scope and sequence, but when we think about curriculum, we had a lot of curricular resources. We were constantly working stuff. We had no writing program. Like, our first grade team wrote writing units ourselves because we were like, we don't have any scope and sequence. So we had release time that we would do that, right? But most teachers don't get that. And really, you don't have enough time to write your own curriculum. Any of us were trained in that, really. But one of the things they brought down was like, you need to do an author study. And so they said, like, you have to do an author study with your kids, and here's your 3 authors you can choose from. So Jan Bratt, white woman; Tommy DePaula, white man; Ezra Jack Keats, white man, right? So I love all those authors, absolutely. Tommy DePaula is like my favorite growing up because his family matched mine, Irish and Italian. It was very much like my family. But I was thinking about the kids in front of me, and I thought they really need an opportunity to see kids that don't look like them. And I knew about everyone probably knows The Snowy Day. That's Ezra Jack Keats, right? So that book won a Caldecott Medal because when it was written in 1963, it was the first like children's picture book that had a child of color as the main character in it, right? So with the choices I had, a limited choice, I chose to do the Ezra Jack Keats author study with my kids because I wanted my kids to see kids that didn't look like them and what a city looked like, and most of Ezra Jack Keats' books, so the Peter series is like a whole series, and it's what you watch Peter grow up in this series. And so one of the books I didn't know about, so that's like what this project became, so I'm not gonna like spend a ton of time, but like we had to go through, and it was like, you're gonna figure out, I had to pair it with the other parts of my curriculum, so it became like an 8-week course where it was like, we needed to teach kids about story structure and how does a story work. So this is like very old. I think it was 2006. I don't know. I was trying to figure out the year. It's 2005 or 2005, 2006 school year, I think, right? So it's old. I would do things differently now, but I'm not doing that now. So anyway, they had to do the illustrations in the medium Ezra Jack Keats, and let's see. So we had to align it to our standards, show what we're covering, like what were we doing. So I could show that this was standards aligned. It wasn't just like making it up so people weren't, you know, we had a lot of parent involvement, which was good, and a lot of accountability, right? So I needed to make sure I was doing that. So when we framed this out, we wanted to make sure the kids were doing all these different things and trying to link as much as possible. But the social studies connection that I made with the kids is that we were going to study about Ezra Jack Keats, learn about him and the time of history that he was an author, and then write a summary about that we would share with families when they came to an author breakfast at the end, so we could explain why it was so important that Ezra Jack Keats did this work and chose to have a child of color in his work in 1963, which was, I mean, civil rights movement's going on, right? So it's a really good time, but it was also a very kind of risky time, right? So I actually talked to Dr. Curry about this project, and I was like, you know, can you give me like feedback on this? Because like, I really like trust your opinion and honor the work that you do. And so she had said, well, it would be really great if you had, you know, an author of color. And I was like, I 100% agree. Like if I were gonna do this today, I would do an author of color. I would probably, if I was gonna do an author study, right, to really pump it up. at the time, I had limited choice, and I wasn't, I mean, I think about myself now versus myself then, and I would look different teaching in that school system now than I looked then, right? Because, you know, I'm a different person. But at the time, I did the best I could for what I knew. I guess that's like my point, right? So like, we're trying to do the best we can for what we know, but we can always still improve, and we can go to the people that we can ask for feedback and input. And so I take that, I would do a different author study, right? And so I said, okay, but for what I did, like at the time, I'm like, was that the good? And she said, well, I really love that you tried that. So I appreciated that she at least took time to even talk to me about it, right? But anyway, so this was part of our stuff before. We think about Essential 10. We communicated this with the family. We had the family members were allowed to come in and help us with this project. They would have the kids read books to them. Kids did partner reading. The things like Nell was talking about yesterday, right? So the kids, we had multiple copies of every text. The kids would partner read those texts together, go through writing a story map. So they had to really go through this. Again, were there things that would change? Yes. The kids each, like, we typed an invitation, but then they illustrated one, and then we had an RSVP, and so we had this big piece. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but things that we do right now in our work of the essentials were things that I had the opportunity to do. I didn't have the curriculum. I could have done much better with things, but I just share it as an example of like ways that we can think about any choice points we do have where we can make a choice in our work, that we can think about how we're representing other children and how we're valuing other children and other people that don't look like us. We can take, like, I just encourage you to take that opportunity. So anyway, there's just some kids working on it, and they did they're writing a response. Oh, this was the one I did want to tell you about this book. I left this one in for, so My Dog is Lost. Has anyone ever read this story before? My Dog is Lost? It's like very little known Ezra Jack Keats book. It's actually one of my most favorites. And so in this book, Juanito has just moved from Puerto Rico to New York. And this book is very different medium, right? Because it's like just white and it's a charcoal pencil, but the kids actually did do this, and I didn't put a million examples, but they did re-illustrate it and draw it out in charcoal pen, and they do the same medium as My Dog is Lost. And Juanito's dog runs away, and he can't speak English, and he's in New York City, and he's going around trying to find his dog. And so he's going around and he's saying, you know, mi perro ha perdido the whole time. And so people can't understand him. And so then he's doing descriptions. And so like the story is beautiful because what happened is over the course of it, he meets all these different kids in the neighborhood, and they end up giving him like the English words for it. And then he's saying the Spanish words about like, he's big and he's red and he's fluffy. And so in the end, they find like a police officer at the park, and they're like, he's frantically like, my dog is lost. And so I was like, oh, your dog is lost. Like, what's he look like? And so then all the kids are screaming out the words that they like translated, but you still see them in Spanish. And so it's when I think about like translanguaging practices and trying to get books with like, this was like one of my favorite books ever to read aloud to the kids, and we'd practice saying the Spanish words. And so I just was thinking about this project and that we did so long ago, but in terms of a lot of the things that we're talking about this week of trying to incorporate other pieces in our classrooms. And so this is just some examples of that. There's me very young without wrinkles at our like groups working. Some of our kids, so they would side by side write their connections to the text. And you can see how the books are displayed. It's because they had choice. I didn't tell the kids which book groups they had to be in. They got to choose which book group they went in. They went to that book group every day, and they rewrote the story, and they had to agree upon it. So they would write the words for their retelling, and they had to come to agreement about what the words were in their final text at the end of the project. And yeah, the slides didn't transfer over. Super great. And they always had a teacher or sometimes a parent who could come in and lead the group of conversation. But we did lots of, and again, this is so old. I think about what the heck was I using? Kidspiration. I mean, we didn't have smart boards or iPads. I mean, this is like so old school, you guys. I was like, wow, if I had a smart board in my classroom or iPads like back then. But just showing how the kids kind of broke down. A Letter to Amy is Ezra Jack Keats' book, that one. And that's when Peter's inviting a friend to a story, so to a birthday party. So anyhow, I just thought this might be See, Kidspiration. I thought it was so cool at the time, but really, we're so far ahead of things now. But anyway, that's just one example. And so, oh my gosh, sorry, I forgot there was like all these transitions when I put this in there today. But we really did try and just make a difference. So I was hoping you might turn and talk to think about, I'll have you talk because I feel like we've been talking at you a lot, but just think about opportunities that you can think of right now where you might be able to make a difference in the work that you're doing. And certainly, I'm so glad that Lisa could share about the Diverse Tech Set project, because we can be actionable about that through MAISA, but what things might you be able to do where you are. So I'll give you a moment to think. Hope it didn't take too long. So you go ahead and you can turn and talk about it, or write, I mean, whatever feels good to you right now.
All right. Sorry to stop you in these conversations. We do have another little time for broader reflection coming up. But I just wanted to highlight these suggestions for curriculum and instruction from Dr. Mohammed's book. Creating a rubric for publishers is just her first step. She also suggests funding teachers and partners to write or redesign curriculum, to get input from diverse populations when you're developing curriculum, and to make sure we're addressing all 5 pursuits: skills, identity, intellect, criticality, and joy. So I want to highlight, we don't have time to get as deep into this, but I wanted to highlight too, there are issues with equity, there are issues with research, but then there are also issues where your curriculum may not align with teachers' beliefs and teacher knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge about how to teach reading. And so even after all the work that we did to select select bookworms in East Lansing, and to be clear, the teachers voted overwhelmingly the teachers who piloted both curriculum voted overwhelmingly for bookworms. I think it was 85% of the teachers who piloted bookworms said that they would continue doing it, and 85% of the teachers who piloted the other one said that they would not be willing to continue doing it. So there was a ton of teacher buy-in in this process. There were teachers on the committee. And yet, during our first year, one of the coaches came to me and she was like, the kindergarten teachers are going rogue. They're gone. They've left the building. And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, they're all just doing exactly what they used to do. They're freaking out. They don't think the kids are learning their high frequency words as fast as they used to. They don't think the kids are learning their alphabet letters as fast as they used to. They're really concerned. And so they're going back to their old, the kids haven't read any books yet. They used to be reading level A readers on the first day of kindergarten. Now they're not reading any books. They're like completely freaking out and doing their own, and getting all their old materials out. And so we had, what we found was that we had some pedagogical content knowledge and belief system conflicts around the use of level text in kindergarten, around how to teach high frequency words, about how to teach alphabet knowledge. And also there's a very specific thing in bookworms called, in the differentiated reading block, called dictated sentences that they didn't understand what the purpose of it was. Also, they hadn't been doing the volume of explicit instruction that the curriculum asked for. They were uncomfortable standing and talking at the front of the room to the kids as much as they were being asked to do. And they just were anxious about the change. That they didn't understand that it would take. Well, they didn't trust. I don't want to say understand, because I think they do understand, but they didn't trust that it would take time to see the positive changes from moving to this curriculum. So I can't get too much into what we ended up doing. Whoops. But basically what we ended up doing was having a lot of little PD sessions in which I got to come and talk to the kindergarten teachers specifically in the bad kids room, but they would have PD, this whole group PD for everybody else, and I would go work with the kindergarten teachers, and they're lovely. I mean, I love the kindergarten teachers, but we would just talk through some of these things, and part of it is an emotional issue too, right? We had to talk about what they got out of as teachers, what they got out of handing a kid a level A text and seeing them appear to read. You know what I mean? What emotionally that did for them, right? And then kind of talk about, well, what you were seeing didn't necessarily match up with what was happening cognitively in their brains that would help move them towards reading, right? And so it's sort of we just kind of had to have Jake Downs, who has the Teaching Literacy podcast, he calls this having a funeral for a practice. He's like, we can't just say don't do it. We need to have a little funeral where we talk about why we did it in the first place and what we thought we were trying to do and why we liked it and what it feels like to be without it, you know? And so we kind of had like little curricular funerals for things, and got them on board. And that involved the research, but not just the research, the emotion part of it, the feeling that, you know, about how they're supporting students. And so we walked through this, the dictated sentences piece that just really needed to be connected to some of their other pedagogical knowledge, right? They know about interactive writing and the value of writing and invented spelling, and they just weren't seeing dictated sentences as a rich opportunity for that work. So sort of connecting those pieces, you know, there was just a little bit of work that had to happen around all of these pieces in kindergarten. But at the end of the year, what we found was that the kindergarten, well, and also there is some research that shows it takes a few years to see any sort of improvement after adopting a new curriculum. But at the end of the kindergarten year this year, our kindergarten scores were off the charts, way higher than normal. First grade was a little bit higher than normal. Everybody else is still all over the place, but that's to be expected, right? Kindergarten is where you would hope to see change happening first because of those concrete skills. So by the end of the year, we were able to show that data, and the kindergarten teachers felt really good about the changes. But it was a process. It was not just one step. And so there will be things like this in any curriculum in any district, right? There will be teachers who have been doing things a certain way for a long time. It'll be different things with different situations. And that is a kind of misalignment that we have to think about how to address as well. So I wish we had more time to get into all of that, but we do have more time. That's the good news. We do have more time. We have, this is the beginning of a whole year of community work together. So we wanted to give you a little bit of time to reflect in small groups and discuss what you want to see out of the rest of this pathway. And then we have a survey for you to let us know so we can start shaping those groups. It does ask about curricular resources, so we can find ways to connect people who are all working around the same resources, but also questions just in general about what it is you want to do next. And somebody has also asked me to share the research report on wonders and interreading and my view, and we will make sure that's linked in the folder as well. Was there anything else we want to talk about, Andy, before we wrap up our work together?
It's just kind of a note, as I was sitting here looking at these tubs, one of the things I just wanted to say is that, as I mentioned yesterday, it's really hard to get broadcast rights. So just as Lisa was mentioning about the books that were selected that they had, we were limited. There were books that were even more diverse that we put in to be selected for our Michigan Learning Channel that we couldn't get book rights to. So I wanted to name that as well, because not everyone will let their book be read on broadcast. But there are some good diverse texts, and one of them that I got to read, two that were my favorite. There's Meet My Family, about diverse families that are animals and how families look different. It's really cute and very touching. And then another one, instead of, it says, tell us your name, and tell is crossed out, and it's teach us your name, and it's written by a woman in Michigan, in the Detroit area, and it's about the importance of a name, and it really goes well with the work we've done in the coaching network. So I saw that, and I forgot to mention that, so we'll keep working, right? So thank you, and take time to do this reflection until the end when we're done at, talk, reflect, and then we'll put a slide up with our, how you can get in touch with us at the end. Yeah. So that you can see that too.
I want to thank you all for your really deep, thoughtful engagement with this. We planned a lot of activities to get you guys to talk, and then we didn't need all the activities because everybody was sharing and talking, and that was honestly the most valuable thing that we can do. One of the most valuable things we can do in this network is connect and share those experiences. So thank you so much for your engagement. But yeah, we have about 10 minutes to talk in your groups about what you want this year to look like, and then to give us some feedback on the survey.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We'll close it out at 10.
Yeah, we'll let you know when it's 10, and we're because in case you need to go out and get take your break. So, all right, thank you.